this talk that I'm about to give is sort of the background that I bring to the Rainbow Bridge project, and I'm actually not going to talk about the Rainbow Bridge project until the very end. So I'm hoping to give you a kind of context for where a lot of the choices the project is making are coming from and how it relates to some of the academic conversations that are happening in archaeology right now. Just to show you the potential of what the Rainbow Bridge project is doing to kind of actually push forward some of these ideas in a lot of different realms. So, how do we know what we feel? I'd like you to take a minute and close your eyes. Okay. So, take a deep breath. Relax your shoulders. And try to sense how your body is pulled towards the earth. Feel your feet on the ground, your legs on the back of your chair, your head resting on your neck. Now smell this room. Maybe your shampoo, your clothes, a hint of wine and tacos, and maybe the person next to you. Just breathe in the space. Now focus on your skin, your fingers and hands. What tactile sensations are contributing to your experience at this very moment? Is the tag on the back of your shirt itching your neck? Are you comforted by the fabric of your clothes? Can you feel your hands on the side of the chair or each other, each hand? And listen to the room. What can you learn about this place just by the way it sounds, by the way it smells, by the textures under your feet and hands? Now open your eyes and look around you. How do you put all those sensations together? How do you know where you are and who you are with? How do you learn things about this place if you've never been here before? How do you relate to it today if you have? What do you feel from others in the room? So, our every moment is a sensuous experience. We don't just see, touch, taste, and hear. We experience ourselves in the world through a multisensory cacophony, to use a sound word. In some ways, we all feel the same things, but in other ways, we feel very differently. Our physicality, our age, ability, our social identity, our race, class, and gender, and our biography impact what and how we feel. We sense the world both through the apparatus of our body and the contents of our mind. Our memories, our training, our habits, something that a French philosopher named Bourdieu called habitus. So sensory experience is at the foundation of being human, of making sense of anything at all. But the senses, capital T, capital S, aren't structured just by biology, but also by culture. We use language to describe our sensations and create elaborate philosophical systems for understanding them. In this place that academics like to call the West, capital T, capital W, and they don't really mean California, Arizona, and New Mexico, our system of dividing the senses into 5 discrete entities goes all the way back to Aristotle. So the Aristotelian 5, as I like to call them, sight, hearing, touch, and taste. Elsewhere in time and space, speech is a sense, and language is a way of touching people. In medieval times, seeing was considered a tactile sense, and the concept of extramission was what philosophers, mostly monks, used to understand how sight worked, which was actually rays coming out of your eyes and touching things, and then bringing the input back to you. And modern day scholars have identified a number of different senses, a uniquely modern cinema sense, which is a sense of timeless drama that only was made accessible to us through the advent of film and the moving image. Kinesthesis is your sense of movement and balance, and proprioception is your sense of sort of your body in the world, that idea that you can sort of orient towards gravity. And the sense of place, which I'll talk more about in a minute, of being and belonging in space. So in an analysis of my codex scrolls, some archaeologists have discovered that speech was a synthetic sense of touch and sound in the ancient Maya world. So there's a variety of ways of sensing. And historically, in the Anglo-European world, our five senses, touch, taste, smell, and sound, are not all equal either. Seeing is believing, but you've only heard that someone had a divorce and you're not quite sure how to act in the situation, right? While admittedly our eyes can deceive us, we're often not as trusting of our tongues or our hands. And this isn't just a novel byproduct of some old philosophy and social happenstance that has kept it going. The senses have been used to divide groups of people on a scale of more or less human, more or less trustworthy. So this Aristotelian sensory hierarchy is linked to the history of colonial construction of racial hierarchies, which is a very important thing. In the early 1800s, a naturalist, a natural philosopher, German natural philosopher named Lorenz Oken, very seriously developed a racial hierarchy directly parallel to that of the senses. There was the European eye man, seen as more rational and capable of clear vision, the Asian ear man, the Native American nose man, relying on less reliable senses, and the Melanesian tongue man and the African skin man, associated with overly impassioned or primitive senses of taste and touch. So this hierarchy reinforced the primacy of European whiteness as rational through the supposed essential qualities of vision as truth, and the less reliable, morally corrupt, and primitive other through the lesser senses. So it became this sort of arbitrary division of the senses becomes the basis for these divisions. So if we recognize that the senses exist in the past, we can make our representations of the past better. And heritage projects, of which I would include the Rainbow Bridge Monument Valley Expedition ONWARD project, that consider the senses, can add a sensuous and emotional dimension to our understanding of past lives. But why would we do that, and how would we do that? Well, why we would do that is because the senses as a structure of understanding our experience are infinite. There are many, many different sensory modalities and hierarchies. They're culturally and historically contingent. They are based on time and place. They're political, as the example of the hierarchy I just showed you. They're powerful. They actually make things happen. And they're evocative and they're emotional, which to me all sums up into they're important. They are doing work in the world. So the how question I'm going to kind of give an extended response to. I'm going to talk about an example of a sensory archaeology project that a professor of mine, Kent Lightfoot at the University of California, Berkeley, and I have sort of proposed and are developing. And then I'm going to talk about some ways forward for this kind of understanding of the senses in the past. So I'm going to talk about the California missions, which most, if not all of you, are probably pretty familiar with living in Southern California. And if any of you went through the public school system here, you had to do the 4th grade mission project, and you had to build a mission out of sugar cubes or styrofoam or whatever, which I've heard they are no longer requiring. So, but they're not taking the missions out of the curriculum. So, just a quick overview for those of you who may be a little further away from 4th grade than not. From 1769 to 1823, the Spanish established 21 missions and pueblos and presidios to go along with in order to colonize the land and people of the west coast of North America. Here they are. And they were originally intended as temporary centers of spiritual and civic conversion until they were secularized in 1834. The friars of the California missions used a variety of strategies to convert the indigenous population to Catholicism, turn them into loyal citizens of the Spanish crown, and capitalize on the products of their labor through agriculture and craft production. And tactics for enculturation varied from mission to mission, but in the Northern California missions, so as a PhD student at the University of California, Berkeley, but a native of Southern California, I've been forced to tend to my Northern Californian counterparts and focus there for now. So in Northern California, the dramatic resettlement of native Californians through what the Spanish called reducción programs forcibly brought people from previously separate polities together under the physical, spiritual, and, in my case, importantly, sensorial influence of Spanish colonists and Franciscan friars. So the way this worked was the Spanish set up an idealized California mission settlement that was meant to organize a chaotic foreign landscape by anchoring a church and mission quadrangle surrounded by agricultural areas, and then beyond that would be sort of considered the hinterland. So you can see here, what's in the hinterland is mysterious and untrustworthy on that side, and then the mission itself sort of holds on to some sort of order in the Spanish logic of this. So generally, converted neophytes or newly baptized native Californians lived within or just outside the mission quadrangle. Oh, sorry, you need this to understand that. And relocated but unbaptized native Californians would occupy villages nearby. And so there's sort of a spectrum of division between what the Spanish would consider civilized and uncivilized. And all of this architecture was the spatial marker of spiritual and civic conversion. So if you were fully baptized, you were living near the mission. If you were sort of on the road, you were living in the villages beyond. And if you were beyond that, you were not doing what the Spanish wanted you to do. So part of this conversion process is native Californians who are within this mission sphere of influence, participating in a dramatic sensory engagement with Spanish forms of dress, food, labor, architecture, material culture. And I note this not because historians and archaeologists have overlooked the material impacts of colonial entanglements, that's a big deal, but because all of those material transformations have sensorial effects, which is something that is less of a big deal within the academic literature about colonial encounter. So changing materials and form of dress aren't just visual, though there's been a lot of visual analysis of the representations of native Californians through the Spanish eye. They're tactile and haptic changes which are experienced bodily and habitually while moving, standing, sleeping, working, and resting. Similarly, changes in foodways, which scholars have analyzed, not just the kinds of food consumed, but how and when and why they are prepared, have sensorial auras of bodily movement, taste, smell, and sound. The use of different architectural styles, building practices, and even simply the very presence of materials like metal and glass, previously not used in Northern California, create new multi-sensorial fields if we're going with our idea that every experience includes a lot of these senses that we break down, that are inseparable from the concepts of memory, identity, and placemaking, which is very important to telling the histories of missionization. So those experiences feed back on themselves through this thing that academics call habituation, which is basically the experience you have when you go home after being away on a long trip and you suddenly smell your house. Whereas during your day-to-day life, if you are there every day, you don't notice, right? So that we sort of internalize and normalize a lot of the sensory experiences we have because it's distracting. So the one thing that I make sure to say when I'm talking about this kind of work is that it's important to stress that sensory enculturation isn't just a process of placing new sensory inputs onto passive native Californian bodies. There's a whole history and culture of sense and sense making that's already at play when the Spanish come to Northern California. So it's important to remember that when you're thinking about this. And even in the harsh disciplining of the body, that constrained and erased many of those existing sensory fields. So, you know, you're forced to wear Spanish clothes instead of native clothes. You're forced to eat a certain way and move through your day at a certain time. Spanish enculturation projects intermixed with existing native Californian sense and sense making. So we can, if we are thinking about this, and the thing that always happens to me as I work through this idea is it becomes almost a yeah, duh moment. Like, yeah, okay, we smell stuff all the time. And they would have too, because we're all people all the time. But what we can start to do is consider how the smell of baking bread, the mooing of cows, the feel of wool, the kinetic experience of agricultural labor as opposed to hunting, and different kinds of plant cultivation, or the ringing of chapel bells, were not only new inputs made sense of through native bodies, but how they informed the active negotiation of relocation, conversion, and resistance to this. So this guy, Father Paulo, woo, told you. A Franciscan friar and colleague of the well-known mission leader Junipero Serra, wrote in the mid-18th century of the importance of sensory aspects of enculturation, which gets me to the start of this show, finally. And I blame him for everything that has come since I read this. So he wrote, they, and he meant native Californians, can be conquered first only by their interest in being fed and clothed, and afterwards they gradually acquire the knowledge of what is spiritually good and evil. If the missionaries had nothing to give them, they could not win them over. If the Indians did not live in a town within the hearing of the mission bells, but rather in their villages after the fashion of their pagan days, okay, naked and hungry, blah, 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 the missionaries would not be able to get them to leave off their vicious pagan practices. So right away, the description of the mission bells gives you a sense of the Spanish friars' view of what enculturation was for: vicious pagan ways, traditional native practices, two different approaches, right? But it also evokes this idea of a soundscape of enculturation, that there's a material spatial connection between sound and place through the idea of the mission bells. So this other guy, fast forward to contemporary time, there you go. So instead of sort of built demarcations on the landscape that is the church and the mission, there's these sonic territories that are mapped out. So historian Alan Corbin, who's another French guy, has this really wonderful book that calls our attention to the power of bells in the 19th century French countryside. And there he describes the role of bells in structuring both individual and communal identities. So your bell and the sound of your bell sort of structures your day and who you associate with. And civic and religious territories. So where your town is and where your church is marked out by the sound of these bells. So he calls this the experienced shape of territories. So we think of territories as usually drawn on maps, but when we're in the world, how do we know the difference between here and there? It's a multi-sensorial thing, and in this case, it's a sonic thing. How far you are from the 405 might be marked either visually or sonically, when you can stop hearing the freeway, and there's all these little spaces in town where you finally can't hear any of the freeways, right? So this historian, Corban, also directs our attention to the spiritual efficacy and the Catholic implications of bells. And the sound of bells have the power to open a path for the good angels from heaven to ward off the creatures from hell. So thinking back to what the Spanish friar wrote, the being within the sound of the bells is where you're spiritually safe. You're being looked after, for lack of a better word, by the reach of the bells. So what impact does this kind of thinking have on the interpretation and education of mission history from a Spanish perspective or a native perspective? And what it really does is it changes the narrative about how people were relocated and all the forces that were at play in thinking about Spanish control over native people. And so where Kent Lightfoot and I are going with this is to start using a model of the sound of some of the mission bells in Northern California to look at places where native people might have had more or less freedom or been under more or less surveillance, and look at some of the existing information we have about archaeological sites there, as well as do new survey based on the idea that this territory is not just, how many miles away are you from the mission church, but where are you within this soundscape? And so there's also other accounts that show in San Francisco, Mission Dolores is kind of right in the middle of what is now San Francisco, and the Presidio is out to the north, if any of you are familiar with it. And it's quite a ways. I don't know exactly how far, but there's accounts that native neophytes would be sent to work in the Presidio, because that's where a lot of the labor took place. And they could hear the sound of the mission bells all the way out to the northern point of San Francisco because of the topography and the nature of the way sound moves. And that would be their call to come back to the mission. So that's not necessarily a safe place where you're still going to practice dances or other ceremonies that you still think necessary, even if you are baptized, or how you know when you might be far enough away if you've tried to escape. All sorts of possibilities there. So, okay. Moving on. So I've argued a couple things through the use of that example. One is that people in the past experienced things sensorially. Okay, another duh moment, but it's actually a big deal for academics who tend to focus on the material of their discipline, and often because of that constriction, give us kind of like a silent black and white movie version of the past. We know people were moving around, we can see them. For archaeologists, we see them through their material traces, the architecture, the objects they've left behind. But we're missing stuff. And so I've also argued that this matters because if we don't think about it, we forget about all these other ways of being that are not just in that black and white movie, that are not just people moving around, they're interacting, they trade, they have babies, and they disappear. To oversimplify some decades of really excellent scholarly work. Okay, so where does this get us in terms of thinking about the ONWARD project as a attempt to use some new visualization practices and other ideas to represent a collection of material, a collection of histories, and a landscape? Well, it's basically about telling stories. So the way we tell stories, in case you've never told a story before, can happen in basically one of three ways. You can use words, once upon a time. You can use images, comic book fans will understand. And I would argue you can use places. One of the main interventions, innovations of the ONWARD project is attempting to reinsert the collections, accounts, and histories of the expedition and its finding into a dynamic landscape. Not just because the land itself is another artifact that holds information, but because it's the integral sensory context to understanding all these interactions of hundreds, if not thousands of people over hundreds, if not thousands of years. Plus it's beautiful. I don't zoom in on those images, but you probably all know. And in fact, another sense that we, the academics, talk about is the sense of place, which is really important in this case. And the sense of place is the combination of experiences that make places more than just spaces. Because place is an embodied experience. So thinking about the meditation I asked you to do at the beginning, there's a lot of things that come together for us to feel comfortable enough to sit around with strangers in someone's backyard and have a good time. And it's comprised of multisensorial perception. That is my soapbox. I will say the word multisensorial until it's normal. And it's tied to these processes of memory, identity, and power, which are why we're trying to tell multiple stories with the Rainbow Bridge Project, that there's a lot more going on than just somebody's personal family history, that all these things are tied into the flow of time and how people understand themselves in the world. There's lots of ways people do that now. Theater is one of these, just being a really good storyteller. I also work in northern New Mexico, and I work with this guy, Virgil Trujillo, who has spent endless hours listening to his elders' stories about his family and the land they live on. And he just sits and tells a story, and suddenly you're back to 1754 when his father is getting kidnapped out herding sheep. And all he did was say things. That's harder for some of us than others. So also, when we're trying to evoke multiple senses at once, we sort of need to get creative. So I'm going to show you a quick couple examples because I'm getting on in time here. But I'm just going to show you a few examples that have inspired me in thinking about the ways forward with things like the Mission Bells or like the ONWARD project and a bunch of the other projects I'm working on, about the potential of integrating virtual experiences, real experiences, creative experiences together to try to get at some of these things. And one of my other soapboxes is that we often get caught up in attempting to recreate the past, and especially when thinking about the senses, it becomes very clear that that's impossible. It's impossible to perfectly recreate what somebody in Pompeii felt the day before Vesuvius erupted, because they were bringing with them their physicality, their own memories, their biography to what we simplify as touch, taste, smell, and sight. But what we can do is evoke similar sensory experiences in ourselves to try to challenge our assumptions about what that must have been like. And getting close, really good recreations is always fun and helpful. So this is a project by a really talented GIS and augmented reality guy at the University College of London, called Dead Men's Eyes and Dead Men's Nose. And so basically what he does, he's done this on a number of sites now, is he'll take information he has about a site and create an augmented reality app so you can explore it. And here you can see this is a site in the UK that once was a village, and those stones are real and those huts are not. And you can walk around and experience it that way, including sound.
I'm going to show a video which has the esteemed Roman religion expert, Dr. Anna Koller, who has the misfortune to be my wife, and you'll see why that's a misfortune in a minute. So she's trying it out at the prehistoric trail in Molsgaard Museum in Denmark in August. We did this on a Sunday, so the kids are here as well, so excuse all of the shouting. Oh, there's one. Excuse all of the shouting.
So this is when archaeologists try to get fancy and make stuff that probably other professionals would be better at, but got to start somewhere.
Trail. And in this case, I've programmed the dead man's nose, as I call it, to play cannibal cave scent as you get closer.
I guess it's kind of smoky and kind of.
You can just see the fan moving now.
Woody.
That one's spinning about.
Wow. It's a very kind of evocative smell that I can't recognise. That's the thing. It's kind of like cold smoke, cold wood smoke or something. But I can't quite place it. And it's mingling with the smell, the natural smell here as well. So. Yeah. What other things? A bit fiery. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So you can see that this is an attempt, and you know, it's a little clunky. It's not like your Disneyland version of a seamless experience that just happens to you. But smell is one of the hardest senses to evoke, and it is one of the most powerful senses in our sort of contemporary experience of it. You know, you can smell a certain kind of grass and be transported back 40 years to a place you grew up and have never been back to. Perceptive scientists are trying to figure out why it does, but it does hold a lot of memories. So it's one of these important things that, you know, if we can begin to explore it, we probably should. And if we have to wear dorky things around our neck to smell a musty cave, then fine. There's also a project here in LA called the Center for Creative Olfaction, and I highly recommend you look it up. It's really wonderful. So another sort of quick example is a really wonderful project by a historian named Emily Thompson from NYU called the Roaring Twenties. And what she's looking at are mostly documents, some film from New York in the 20s, which really marks the rapid urbanization and industrialization of the city as a way to show how much things were changing. And so since I'm into the bells, this is a film of a fog warning bell from 1929 in New York Harbor. And so all of these sounds you can hear. So you can hear in the background tugboat horn, crowds, all these things. You can explore this on the internet. It's an interactive map through the Vectors project at USC. And so it really changes the approach of looking at a map of a city to listening to a map of a city. There's also archival documents like noise complaints, which rose rapidly in the 20s in New York. So this is a Japanese governor was visiting New York for the first time. And he said, my first impression of New York was its noise. When I know what the sounds mean, I will understand civilization. So he's on the bandwagon with the importance of the senses. And then finally, there are artists who explore this, and there are many artists who explore this in a lot of different ways. But one work that I was exposed to early on in thinking about this in the project was the work of Janet Cardiff. And I never know if it's Jorge or George, but whatever, Mr. Miller. So Janet Cardiff is well known for something called a sound walk. And she's sort of expanded the relationship between the physical world of the viewer and an visual and sonic experience that overlays that.
Okay, turn the camera on. press the video button. I'm sitting here right now with you in the train station in Castle, watching the people pass by. It's very intimate in ways, watching people. You can see how they walk, so you can tell if they're happy or sad or lost somewhere in their minds. This video will be an experiment. We're like those prisoners stuck in Plato's cave. We watch the flickering shadows on the screen. Try to align your movements with mine. Move your screen up to the left as I do. A red coat. I used to have one. Wonder where it went. So many people wear black here. Garbage pails have moved. Do you see the musicians? They're between the pillars now. Let's get up. Follow them. And turn to the right.